Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the U.S. Japan Research Institute seminars on technological innovation and expansion of the Asia Pacific. I'm Katsurichi Uchida, President of USJI and also Vice President of Waseda University. USJI is a non-profit research institute in Washington, D.C., established in April 2009 by leading Japanese universities, now managed by 8 universities, namely Dosha, Keio, Kyoto, Kyushu, Tsukuba, University of Tokyo, Ritsumeikan, and Waseda universities, and financially supported both by US and Japanese business societies. The mission of USJI is to promote policy-related research, to nurture young researchers, and to formulate a community of researchers and policymakers. With regard to research activities, USJI focuses on 3 main topics, such as environment and energy, security issues, and regional collaboration. USJI organizes a few research teams consist of researchers from both Japanese and US institutions, and they publish research results and held seminars. USJI usually holds a week-long seminars twice a year, in March and September, here in Washington, D.C., and occasional seminars once or twice a month, and sometimes hold symposiums in Japan. For example, last December, USJI held seminars titled The First Year of the Abe Administration and Direction for the Future Diplomacy and Security Strategies. A keynote speaker at the time was our former US Ambassador to Japan, Michael Post, and Japanese Defense Minister, Mr. Itsunori Onodera. Also, from last year, USJI started Japan 101 seminar series with US Asia Institute, US Japan Council, and National Bureau on Asian Research to discuss fundamental socio-economic and political issues of current Japan in order to provide useful information to people in Capitol Hill. With regard to the details of our activities, please check out our website. And this week we'll hold 10 different events covering a wide range of topics. And this afternoon, this particular seminar is titled on the technological innovation and expansion of the Asia Pacific. And this is quite an interesting topic and for the future of US-Japan relations. We are very fortunate to have a group of distinguished scholars. And I'm sure that today's discussion will be stimulating and will produce fruitful and productive results. And before introducing moderator Professor Oga, I would like to ask to receive your permission of video recording in the seminar and open it to the public through the internet with some edit. Thank you for your permission, Professor Oga.
Thank you, President Uchida. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Event 5, Technological Innovation and Expansion of Asia Pacific. I'm Tor Oga from Kyushu University. I'm moderator of this panel. This panel explores US-Japan relations, or more broadly, Asia-US relations, by examining the role of technological innovation in the enlargement of Asia-Pacific region. Technological innovations have led to the regional and global expansion of the Asia-Pacific. The enlargement of Asia-Pacific region and the technological innovation are both key to understanding the nature and formation of US-Japan relations. Well, I introduce speakers and discussants. The first speaker is Professor Yuki Oi of Nanzai University. She talks about the steamships in the late 19th centuries. The second speaker is Professor Munehiro Miwa of Kyushu University. He focuses on the aviation gasoline technology used during the Second World War. And after the speaker's presentation, we welcome 2 discussants, Professor David Painter of Georgetown University and Professor Daki Nyang of George Washington University. So Firstly, Professor Ooi, please.
Thank you, Professor Oga, and good afternoon to everyone here. My name is Yuki Oi, and from Nanzai University in Nagoya, Japan. Today, I'd like to talk under the title "Steamship on the Border Between Inclusion and Exclusion of Asia." The development of steamship in the mid-19th century that connected Asia and the United States marked a new era, beginning a new era in which the major cities of the world became intertwined by steamers. Steamships not only carried a large number of migrants from Asia, China and Japan in particular, to the US, but also eventually led to the growth of international travel from the US to other countries. Steamship companies' brochures for international travel began to depict the Asian countries as the Orient. They promote Asian countries to Americans as travel destinations. On the other hand, the world's fairs what fairs are like exposition today, were held in the US in the late 19th century, also displayed the Orient in their venues to entertain its visitors. Meanwhile, the overrepresentation of Chinese and later Japanese laborers who had come to the US by steamship resulted in a series of Chinese and later Japanese exclusion acts that marginalized the Asian immigrants and made it impossible for the first generation of Asian immigrants to become American citizens. Therefore, it can be said that Asia and Asian people living and working in the US were excluded politically and socially, while being included economically as labor supply and entertainment. And my research question for today's presentation is, how did development of technology influence the relation between the US and Asian countries? More specifically, what did development of trans-Pacific route of steamship in the late 19th century bring to the relation between Asia and the US? And in order to answer this research question, my presentation attempts to show how development of steamship in the late 19th century provided a background for the already mentioned exclusion and inclusion to happen simultaneously. And my presentation will be divided into two parts. The first part will explore how American steamships connected American cities domestically. It also will deal with how steamship services linked the US with American Asian cities. Given the already existing transatlantic steamship route between the east coast of the US and European countries, the Trans-Pacific route made it possible for people and cargo to move around the world much faster, more safely, and more punctually. The second part will look into how the opening and development of the new route influenced the rise of sightseeing trips abroad, especially to Asian countries. By examining these two points, this presentation attempts to show how exclusion of Asian groups from American society and advancement of city network were articulated through the development of steamship and the Trans-Pacific route. Now, I'd like to go to the first part. International migration across the ocean required technical development. Migrants could have not possibly immigrated to the US in such large numbers in the 19th century were it not for steamships, which were bigger, safer, faster, and more comfortable than sailing ships. The new steamship business was pioneered by the Pacific Mail Steamship Company. Hereafter I call it the PMSC. However, the PMSC's initial ambition was not to connect Asia and US, but the west and east coast of the United States. The PMSC, Pacific Mail Steamship Company, first began regular service for mail and people to travel from eastern to western cities. The necessity for this kind of transportation dates back to the Oregon Treaty of 1846 between the US and the UK. The treaty put an end to the disputes over the northern territory of Oregon Treaty country, to which both countries claimed their right. and divided the country into two parts. One belonged to the US and the other belonged to the UK. According to the census, as a result of the land conflict resolution, the population of Oregon grew from 13 in 1840 to 1,475 in 1844, and from 4,000 in 1847 to 12,000 in 1850. People came to the west via the hazardous Oregon Trail, which runs through the Great Plains and the Rocky Mountains. In addition to the dangerous nature of the route, it took 4 to 6 months to reach the west from the Midwest. Therefore, safer and faster ways of connections between the east and west coast was necessary. An alternative to the land route proposed at the Federal Congress was to develop new ship services between the two coasts. The U.S. Congress also demanded better connection for other reasons. First, they were concerned that settlers in Oregon were not necessarily loyal to American government. The government was afraid that if they left the settlers alone without attention and protection, they would become even more loyal to the UK. Second, the settlers began to organize a temporary government themselves in 1843 because there were many claims to land ownership. Therefore, in order to make sure that people in Oregon belonged to America and followed its rule, new forms of transportation that could connect the east and west more easily was necessary. The PMSC was the most successful among steamship companies for two reasons. First, U.S. government supported them financially. They received subsidies from the government. Second, gold discovered in the Sutter's Mill, California provided a boost to the company. The fastest way to reach California from east was to travel on a PMSC steamship, so many miners rushed to buy tickets. On its first voyage to San Francisco in 1848, the final destination was Oregon. Steamship California carried 365 people, which was about twice as many as it was designed to carry. Between 1848 and 1869, about 600,000 people sailed to California on their steamships. As a result of increased demand, the PMSC expanded their business. In terms of budget, they increased their capital from $400,000 to $2 million in 1850. Service increased in 1860 from once a month to once every 10 days. By putting more effort into local services along the West Coast, the PMSC strengthened the connection between the Pacific and Atlantic coasts. The PMSC offered the fastest and safest service by 1869 when the Transcontinental Railroad was completed. The company anticipated losses when President Lincoln signed the Pacific Railroad Act into law in 1862. In order to survive and to win a competition with railroad companies, the PMSC needed to shift their focus of business from the east-west connection to somewhere else, and now they turned their attention to Japan and China. In February 1865, the Federal Congress authorized the PMSC to start a once-a-month service, sailing from San Francisco to Hong Kong via the Sandwich Islands and Japan. For this, they received government subsidies worth $500,000. The PMSC shifted their focus and expanded the new Trans-Pacific service. They navigated among cities on the Pacific Rim, in particular those of Japan and China, such as Yokohama, Kobe, Nagasaki, Hakodate, and Shanghai, and Hong Kong. Their first steamer to cross the Pacific Ocean was Colorado, which left San Francisco in 1867. More ships were built for the new route, with names like Great Republic, China, Japan, America, and City of Tokyo. Steamship City of Tokyo played a critical role in Japanese immigration to Hawaii and the mainland US. It brought the first group of Japanese immigrants to Honolulu after an agreement was made between the Japanese and US governments in 1885. Other PMSC steamships such as China and City of Peking also brought a large number of Japanese immigrants to the US. The company doubled their service to once every 2 weeks when Congress increased their subsidy to $1 million. Other national and local governments in New South Wales, New Zealand, and the Kingdom of Hawaii also offered financial stimulus to have the ships stop in their ports. In addition to the government subsidies, the Trans-Pacific service flourished as a result of an increase in trade and migration from China and Japan to the US. Both Chinese and Japanese numbers grew steadily. The ships also brought goods such as rice, silk, tea, flour, and valuables from China and Japan to San Francisco. To further their interest, the PMSC made their services more convenient by increasing the service in Japan, which had previously been prevented by a contract the PMSC had with the Japanese shipping company Nippon Yusen. And posters, PMSC's posters as these, shown in the slides, and brochures published by the PMSC for guests give details about what Trans-Pacific travels were like in those days. As for the frequency of departure, ships left New York for China via San Francisco 3 days a month, and from San Francisco to Hong Kong left once a month. Next, with regard to travel, the voyage from San Francisco to Yokohama took 22 days, and to Hong Kong 29 days in total. Fares are also shown in the brochures. Travel in the first-class cabin on the voyage from New York to Japan, Yokohama, Hyogo, or Nagasaki cost $355 to $385, while the lowest price cabin was about $140. The brochures also describe how to continue on to a further destination. Once at the port of Yokohama, travelers could find connecting ships managed by Japanese company Mitsubishi Yusen to Hyogo, Nagasaki, Shimonoseki, Kobe, and Shanghai. In Hong Kong, they could find more connecting ships to go further west to India and Europe via Suez Canal. With these regular steamship services available and the already existing transatlantic route between Europe and American East Coast, major cities all over the world are now linked by steamship. So as you can see from the map of the PMSC route, worldwide web of steamship was completed. And now I'd like to move on to the second part of my presentation. The opening and development of the new route of steamship influenced the rise of sightseeing trips abroad. What implications does the emergence of steamships have on international migration of Asian people? The question of whether the shift from sailing to steamships raised immigration levels or vice versa has not been definitely answered yet. What's known, however, is that people migrated beyond the boundary of their homeland in unprecedented numbers. Moreover, past research on transatlantic steamship could give some insights, even though the much less analysis has been done on the Trans-Pacific. Most importantly, steamships certainly decreased risk of death on board. First, faster services helped the traveling time. Second, steamships were more spacious, and capacity grew by about 80 times from 1840 to 1914. Third, the iron bodies of the steamship made them safer than sailing ships. These three factors contributed to safer trips. Because of the faster travel times, more spacious rooms, and firm construction, people are less likely to contract a contagious disease on steamship, resulting in the remarkably reduced death rates on shipboard. On the transatlantic route, the death rate decreased by 90%. The emergence of steamship service altered the nature of migration. First, with less likelihood of disease and death on the ships, more men migrated to work temporarily with the intention of returning home in the future. When the sailing ship was more common, immigration meant to live in the receiving country for good to the higher risk of disease and death on ships. So immigrant laborers are more likely to bring their families with themselves. With the emergence of safer steamship travel, a new type of human movement came into focus. That is, modern tours and associated travel industry. Modern tours here means organized and arranged trips whose primary purpose was to be entertained by sightseeing in exotic places in foreign countries. Such modern tours were initially developed by the Reverend Thomas Cook in England in the 19th century, What started as a domestic tour to have fun gradually expanded to destinations in neighboring countries like France and Italy. As a pioneer, Cook enjoyed a world tour in 1872, which coincidentally was the same year a book Around the World in 80 Days was published. Phileas Fogg of London, a main character in the book, successfully completed his world trip in 80 days. And Thomas Cook himself sent about 1,000 customers on world tours until his death in 1892. Meanwhile, in the U.S., a company called American Express developed similar modern tours for entertainment at the turn of the century. The company first started in the business of express mail services, cost $100. In 1890, the number of American tourists abroad was estimated to be more than 90,000. Now I'd like to conclude my presentation. The late 19th century saw the US and Asia being led by steamships. Asia and its peoples began to be consumed as exotic cultures in the US. However, Chinese migrants living in the US raised the Chinese question, and later Japanese migrants raised the Japanese question too, and they resulted in the exclusion and even expulsion of Asian migrants from the United States. Therefore, it is fair to suggest that while steamship created a more globalized connection with cities and more chances to encounter different cultures of Asia, they produced a situation where Asia, China and Japan in particular, was economically accepted into American society, but politically and socially excluded. With this, I'd like to end my presentation. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Professor Oi. Very intensive research on American steamship service in domestic and international, and how the service has been changed in the historical context. Okay, in the next, the Professor Mia, please.
Oh, thank you very much coming here. Let's enjoy my English. My English is with Japanese accent. I call my English Janglish. We use too much aviation gasoline. I use only a small amount of aviation gasoline. Fly short. Look at the table. Japan gets oil about 85% from the United States of America, just before the Pearl Harbor attack. Others Dutch East Indies, not Middle East, from the United States of America. Thank you very much. Japan and the Japanese Navy had been aware of the feasibility of being too dependent on US oil products. In order to reduce the military weakness caused by oil dependency, Japan made the following basic plans. 1, as follows. 2, developing synthetic oil production project, oil from coal. Today, I focus on this program, this matter. And 3, diversifying its oil supplies, for domestic crude oil, and finally, oil shale from Manchuria. Oil shale is good for the submarine diesel oil. Japan used the submarine freely during the World War II because we can get oil shale. This topic is today's topic, but you remember these facts. First one is here. Ban on plant design. December 1939. Moral embargo in July 1940. There is crude oil for aviation split, tetraethyl. Oh, I'm sorry. Go back again. And synthetic oil, there is coal. Coal regasification, Fischer-Tropsch, gasification, coal tar, and oil shale. For Japanese Navy, coal regasification is very important because Japanese Navy thought that coal regasification gasoline is good for aviation gasoline. Japanese Navy believes this is good for motor gasoline. Oh, this is a third level technology. Japanese Navy didn't think high and oil shale. Please look at this. Japanese made, Germans wrong concern for Japanese Navy and Japanese people. Germans succeeded in coal regasification by various coal direct hydrogenation. Incredible. And this again, it's good for aircraft fuel. Japanese Navy believes that they can develop this process by their own way from 1928 onward. The Navy became a true believer. Surprisingly, how poor Japanese is. No, I'm listening. Next, change the topic. I'm sorry. I made a mistake. And one more, 100 octane aviation gasoline is very important. Octane value became a huge issue in the United States, U.S. Army and Navy in 1935. Japan couldn't remain indifferent. Japan watched carefully how to use 100 of aviation gasoline. At that time, Universal Oil Products is very famous for producing its octane. At that time, United States used waste gases from oil refineries, and German used coal tar. And Japan, searching. Japanese Navy searching CO gases. Such alcohol, sugar, everything, except coal tar. Why? I made interviews 30 years ago. I made interviews Japanese veterans. They all of them couldn't believe German use coal tar, because Japanese Navy thought coal tar is a third level technology. Incredible how poor Japanese is. Once again. And one more. Europe's technology and later United States developed the aviation. I'm foolish. Aviation process for is often this way. It's a new way. Japanese Navy stick to UOP production, UOP production technology. But United States changed already, technology changed already, changed to allocation process. German was too late, but German changed UOP process to allocation in 1943. Yeah, but I think this is too late. Japanese Navy stuck to UOP process. The Navy didn't pay attention to arbitration process too. Why? Why? I didn't understand. Oh. Japan came to know the process at Shell Regular BPM plant after occupying the plant, Dutch East Indies. Yeah. Even at that time, Japan stick to UOP process. Navy stick to UOP process. Surprisingly. And next project, catalyst cracking. This process. Japan watched carefully Fusori process and UOP catalyst cracking too. Japan wanted to get this one, but moral embargo prevented further development on December 2039 to get the patent. FBI marked perfectly Japanese chemist, perfectly marked. Just buying the patents, FBI stopped the negotiations. But UP is very kind, secretly gave us a good present to Japanese. Thank you very much for UOP. So Japan made up a plant following the UOP catalyst cracking. And Japan and Germany compare. German use B4 grade and C3 base gasoline, coal hydrogenation base gasoline, and one more is octane and aromatic contains DHD. We call DHD. 2/3 C3 grade Germany. Japan, coal is bad, not good for aviation gasoline. And aromatic is not good because tetrate lead is not working well. Aromatic is bad and culture is bad. Go away. Japanese use hydrocracking, kerosene, and gas oil, gas process and hydrogenation. Japanese Navy use this way. And after Borneo and Sumatra occupation, Japan produced aviation gasoline at the plant of Shell's BPM and standard NKPM. Japan gets a lot of information from Germany aircraft engine radar, not refinery. Quite by separate. No. The next one. Production of aviation gasoline. Please look at this data. Please write down your note. Daily, monthly. I'm surprised. It is quite nature. Japan was completely beaten by the United States. This data. This data is very interesting data too, but I'm running short of the time. So if you are interested in this data, I will give you later. Please look at this data again. In Japan, during the World War II, 1942, Midway battle, and the Canal, Japan using a California crude during the World War II, and East Indies, Shell's company or standard plant there. Tokyo means a naval fuel depot. There is a naval fuel depot. During the World War II, during the Pacific War, Japan used California crude. Surprisingly, thank you very much for United States again. Japan can fight the United States for 4 years and a half using the California crude and using the American plant, company's plant. Oh no, there's no oil. Sadly. Oh. So Japan and German has no communication on refinery technology. Surprisingly, oh, incredible. So Japan depends on the United States technology and United States oil, California crude. This is my presentation. Thank you very much for hearing my speech.
Thank you, Professor Mir. Thank you for the motivating presentation, interesting findings, and a detailed analysis of Japan policy on aviation gasoline and its international relations. So I welcome the two discussants. Firstly, Professor Yo, please.
First of all, I'd like to thank U.S JAG for inviting me to be a participant in this very interesting panel. I teach Japanese history and I did some work in the history of technology of communication. So I found these two papers particularly interesting. They both deal with some aspects of technology, and I would argue, and I agree with Professor Oi, that often when we study history, technology is taken for granted. It's there, it's natural, we don't need to look into technological innovation, how it affects history. I think these two papers convincingly showed us either having the innovation or the lack of can drastically influence the course of history. And all papers are both connected with communication. One is the steamship, the other is aviation. So I think they go very well together. And thirdly, because they deal with transportation, they deal with this aspect of space, or the collapsing of space rather. And this is a very important theme as we talk about, we live in a global village, the world has become smaller, and without these technological innovation, of course, globalization would not be taking place. At the same time, I think both papers remind us that technological innovation is a double-edged sword. It can increase the contact of people and it can provide opportunities for cooperation, but at the same time, it can also increase the likelihood of conflict. Professor Oi's paper talked about this, both inclusion and exclusion of Chinese and later Japanese immigrants to the United States. Professor Miwa's paper focused largely on the military use of aviation fuel, of course, for conflict. Both of these papers are very well researched, and again, it's a pleasure to learn about this cutting-edge research from Japanese scholars. Let me just say a few words about the first paper on the steamship. I very much like the scope. I didn't expect to hear a paper about Chinese immigrants coming to the United States in this U.S. GI, but I think this is a great choice because, as we know, after the Chinese migration, then we have the Japanese migration to the United States, and both they would face the exclusion immigration at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. I think that's a very important reminder brought out by this paper. At the same time, the reverse travel by, I would say, wealthy American tourists to both Japan and China also raised the interesting question to what extent it shaped American view of Asia, and to what extent it began to differentiate between, say, Chinese versus Japanese. My question also would like to extend to Professor Oi concerns the economics of the steamship travel. Yes, as we learned from the paper that the steamship can carry more people more safely, reduce the likelihood of disease on board. But we should also keep in mind that mass migration, sometimes under forced circumstances, have taken place before steamship. Of course, I'm talking about the Atlantic slave trade, which took place without the advantage of steamship. Of course, that's a different kind of economic calculation. In other words, you can afford to lose maybe 10% of the slave and still can make money as long as the rest reach the plantation. Professor Ooi talked about the subsidy. I think that's a very interesting point. Her paper mentioned that, for example, New Zealand, Australia, and other destinations between United States and Asia was willing to put up a subsidy. We can understand there are very good reasons, but maybe she can tell us why the United States were providing subsidies for these Trans-Pacific routes. And I think probably one answer to this is carrying mail, the information, because it is in the government interest, especially when you have diplomatic service in East Asia, to have regular contact. Of course, toward the end of the 19th century, you have telegraph, but until, I believe, the beginning of the 20th century, the telegraph had to go through Europe. And in comparison to telegraph, the regular ship mail can carry parcels and other things that you cannot send over the wires. And then another matter is the competition. You briefly mentioned in your paper that Japanese steamship companies began to ply the waters around Japan. So it will be very interesting to know when Japanese shipping companies entered the Pacific route and to what extent it influenced the U.S. consideration in providing subsidy. Because at this time, I believe all steamship companies receive subsidy from the government. If I may just say a word about Professor Miwa's paper, this is very interesting to me because I'm beginning to study the fuel policy of Japan and its relation to the Pacific War. And in this field, Professor Miwa is the leading expert. He has already published a lot in Japanese on the Japanese fuel policy. My question comes down to this so-called misunderstanding, and you repeatedly said that the Japanese Navy or the Japanese were stupid or foolish. And of course, I don't think this is the end of the story, and that misunderstanding needs better explanation. In other words, which may appear to us to be irrational and foolish, could have been rational to its own players, because this process involved many players. So if we take apart this big misunderstanding and instead examine its constituent parts, perhaps the Imperial Navy was making a rather rational prediction. I think here the history of science would be helpful because they talk about what is called the social construction of technology. So we need to take into consideration many factors, the interest of the Navy itself, the economic calculation, and maybe the belief in the German sort of technology that they could accomplish everything. So I will just leave this question here. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, Professor David Kemta, please.
First, I'd like to thank the U.S. Japan Research Institute for inviting me to participate. I'd also like to commend the two authors on their very thought-provoking papers. I really learned a lot from reading them. Now, while most scholars would agree that technological innovation has played and continues to play an important role in international relations, it's usually very difficult to determine the precise weight to give to technology when analyzing important events and processes in history. Scholars that emphasize the role of technology run the danger of being accused of technological determinism, of arguing that technology determined the course of events. The key, as it often is in historical analysis, is to demonstrate how technology interacted with other factors to produce certain outcomes. The two papers we heard today do a good job of striking that balance, of demonstrating the importance of technology and how it affected and was affected by other factors. Professor Lloyd connects the development of steamship technology with Chinese and to a lesser extent Japanese migration to the United States and to the rise of international tourism. She connects both processes to U.S. legislation prohibiting Chinese immigration. In her view, technology, in this case, the development of larger, faster, and safer steamships, provides the essential background to both developments. While she certainly is correct about the importance of advances in technology, I think it would have strengthened her argument if she brought in more discussion of technology. If she were more specific on when the changes in steamship technology occurred, so they could be more precisely related to changes in Chinese immigration and to changes in U.S. legislation. For example, when did coal-powered steamships replace the hybrid ships that combine sail and steam? In the North Pacific, this probably did not occur until 1880. Similarly, when did iron and steel ships, which were larger and safer, replace wooden ships, in particular on trans-Pacific routes? Again, this probably occurred after 1880. In fact, the U.S. used wooden ships a lot longer than Britain, and combining wood and steam is not particularly safe. Several of these ships burned in fires. Professor Oya argues that the development of inexpensive and safe transportation links between East Asia and the United States was an important factor in Chinese immigration to the United States in the late 19th century. And this immigration contributed to the infamous Chinese Exclusion Acts, first in 1882, renewed again in 1892, and then in 1902. Now, the initial efforts to limit Chinese immigration came before the dramatic changes in steamship technology. This does not invalidate her argument, however. The possibility that technological change could facilitate or even encourage greater Chinese immigration was probably an important factor in legislation setting strict limits to Chinese immigration. Now, on the point of the safer and less expensive transportation links affecting the composition of the immigrant population, especially allowing young male immigrants to travel back and forth, I think, again, it's important to pay attention to the chronology. Now, while the advent of larger, safer, and faster, and less expensive steamships had an impact on the composition of European immigration, Chinese immigration to the United States had traditionally been mostly male. On this issue, more research on the age and gender dynamics of Chinese immigration over time would be necessary to determine if the population changed significantly, and to link these changes to the changing nature of the immigrant population and to the reception of the United States. I also found the discussion of mass tourism very interesting. The quotes from travel literature sound very much like modern travel books. And I really like the way she emphasizes the irony that greater contact with China and East Asia occurred at the same time that the United States was excluding Chinese immigrants. Apparently, increased contact with East Asia did not mitigate pre-existing cultural prejudices. In short, by integrating the role of technology into the history of Chinese migration to the United States, Professor Oya has raised interesting new questions and provided fruitful insights into an important topic. Second, I'd like to discuss Professor Minwood's paper. My specialty is history of oil, so this is very interesting. And as other speakers have noted, he's written extensively on the role of oil in the Pacific. And this paper focuses on why attempts by the Japanese Navy to develop synthetic fuels, and especially high-octane aviation gasoline, failed. His argument shows a deep understanding of complex technological issues. And he stresses the flawed assumptions of Japanese officials in charge of the synthetic fuel program. Japanese officials, primarily Navy scientists and engineers, assumed prematurely that Germany had succeeded in coal liquefaction and that Japan could quickly replicate the German success. They also ignored the fact that Germany produced aviation gasoline from tar obtained by low-temperature carbonization of coal. These flawed assumptions led to the decision to move directly from the laboratory to large-scale production of synthetic fuels without first testing the technology by building sufficient pilot plants. The result was the two coal liquefaction plants that were constructed produced almost no fuel, despite devouring huge amounts of manpower, material, and money. In addition, the focus on coal liquefaction and the similarly complex Fischer-Tropsch process led to the neglect of less complex process for producing liquid fuel from coal, low-temperature carbonization. Indeed, most of the synthetic fuel produced by Japan during World War II was produced using low-temperature carbonization. He also talks about the Navy's focus on the isooctane process and ignoring other processes. Basically, the meager research results of the synthetic fuel program led the 1946 United States Strategic Bombing Survey's report, Oil in Japan's War, to conclude, and I quote, "Strategically, the contribution of Japan's synthetic oil industry to the war may be regarded as negative. The manpower and materials expended on it certainly impeded the national war effort more than the synthetic oil produced aided it." In short, Professor Mewa effectively demonstrates how mistaken assumptions about technology and other mistakes, as well as U.S. efforts to restrict access to technology, led to the failure to produce high-octane aviation gasoline from coal. This had devastating impacts on the Japanese war effort. Although he does not directly issue this issue in his paper, it is worth asking the question, would it have made any difference to the outcome of the war if the synthetic fuel program, and in particular the part of producing high-octane aviation gasoline, if this program had been successful? Certainly, successful large-scale production of synthetic fuel, including aviation gasoline, might have mitigated the devastating fuel situation Japan faced after 1943, as American submarines became increasingly successful in cutting off shipments of oil from the Netherlands East Indies to Japan. But how much of the difference would it have made? In considering this question, one might compare Japan's situation to that of Nazi Germany, which did develop large-scale synthetic fuel program and which also produced aviation gasoline, but not under octane. Yet Germany still lost the war. Producing liquid fuel from coal was a very costly process in terms of manpower, materials, and money. And the vast industrial complexes that produced the fuel were very susceptible to air attack, as Germany found out when the Allies began targeting Germany's plants beginning in spring 1944. Indeed, it is difficult to avoid the conclusion that given the dependence of mid-20th century military power on oil, nations without oil, like Japan and Germany, but also Britain and France, faced insurmountable obstacles in waging modern war as compared to powers with ample resources like the United States and the Soviet Union. Lest this sound too much like geographical or geological determinism, I will add that making use of resources like oil also requires technology, and that other factors were also important. In closing, I'd like to say this was a very important and impressive paper on a very important topic. And I want to close by stressing how much I learned from these two fine papers, and that I look forward to reading more work from these two scholars. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Winte. And there are many interesting points raised by discussants. So, speakers, could you quickly respond to discussant remarks? Around 5 minutes. Firstly, Professor.
Thank you for insightful question and advice. And I received a couple of questions, but I only have one question I can say something about. That is the first question I received. How wealthy Americans trip to Asia reflect the American view of Asian people. Well, I don't have the admin answer to this question, but I'm very interested in this aspect, in this point, and I think I need research at more macro level. And there are travel writings left by American tourists in Japan and China. So I think I want to look into these materials and hopefully want to compare American tourists writing with European tourists in Asian countries. That will be comparisons that might be interesting. That's all.
Thank you. And Professor Mewa, please.
The first question, I made the interviews for Japanese veterans. Japanese veterans could not imagine coal is good for aviation gasoline, getting the sea-hole fluctuations. So, and Japan, Japanese Navy should make efforts to get good communication with German technicians. Japanese Navy only watched U.S. technology carefully for the war. Even now, Nazi Germany is a bad country, but we should look at the war as a war. Japan and German should communicate more smoothly, yeah, and comparing the U.S. UK relations, they communicate very well. So I think, and Japanese army keeps good relations with Germany, but army is lacking in the technical knowledge, scientific knowledge. Yeah. So and Ambassador Ushima should use the German politicians, Goering and sometimes Hitler, to get more information. EG hesitate to give Japan technology informations. Yeah, and so yeah, every country sometimes falling into irrational. This is very difficult in Washington D.C. during World War II on the hilltop. Senator criticized Standard Oil strongly. Standard gives EG too much information. But for me, Standard Oil prevented the EG from giving Japanese information. It's very difficult. Yeah. So yeah. And submarine attack. Yeah. And Japan was very weak in U.S. submarine attacks because United States breaks the Japanese code perfectly. I'm surprised in National Archives in Maryland, Collegeburg, United States know how to go to the from port to port, every ship. Oh, I'm surprised. Oh, yeah, it is impossible to win the game. Japan as Japanese Navy couldn't come to know all codes are break. So yeah, surprisingly now I say again how full Japanese is. I'm sorry. And after the end of the war, Japan again try to develop the code liquefaction again. Oh, incredible for me. Japan and Germany spend a lot of money, but in vain. Japan should stop the coal regulation right now. Every country in the world should spend money on gasification or natural gases. Yeah, and Japan is very weak to the air attack and submarine attack. Germany is very weak from the air attack in 1944. I know. Yeah. Is it okay? I'm sure. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And then now we have another 30 minutes and we're open to the floor. So if you have a questions or if you have a comments, then please raise your hand and please come up to the center of the floor in front of microphone. Yeah.
Good afternoon, Grace Clegg from the East-West Center. First of all, I'd like to thank USGI for yet another fantastic week of programming. There are many U.S.-Japan related programs throughout the year here in Washington, and very rarely do we get the opportunity to have the variety of research that we see during USGI week. So I thank you for the opportunity to hear something new. But my questions are actually directed to Oe-sensei. I'm fascinated by this work on steamships. It's, again, something that you don't hear very often in these circles. And so just two questions. One is, in the course of your research, did you see if the exclusion acts, the Chinese Exclusion Act and the general Asian Exclusion Acts, did that result in a reduced volume of traffic in steamships between Asia and the United States? And then the second question is, did Japanese companies operate steamship lines between Asia and the US, or was that a closed market with the US monopoly? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your interesting questions. As for the first question, the Exclusion Acts of Asian migrants affected the volume or reduced the volume of or number of ships sailing between the U.S. and Japan. Well, actually, as can I use the slides? This slide shows the population of Chinese and Japanese in the United States, and as you see, the number of Chinese decreased after, 1890, and Japanese population began to decrease. Well, it doesn't show the decrease of Japanese population, but its population decreased later than 1910. And as for Chinese. I do not really think, I don't have precise information on that, but I believe that the Exclusion Act didn't really affect the volume and the number of ships between the US and Asia. And actually, the Pacific Mail Steamship Company went into bankrupt and merged with another company in early 20th century. I forgot the exact when, but it was around 1910 or 1920, so I can't say that the Exclusion Act affected the business of the PMSC. And your second question was? Yes, yeah. And as for the Japanese steamship company competed, whether they competed with U.S. steamship companies. Well, as far as I remember, a Japanese steamship company flourished in early 20s, not in the late 90s, when the PMSC was flourishing, so that there was a time difference.
Is that all?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Please.
James, I have a question for Mr. Oe. To run a steamship service across the Pacific in those days, you needed ships and you also needed coal. Did PMS actually set up its own coaling stations, or did it use other people's coaling stations? Were they subsidized by the U.S. government? Was the U.S. Navy involved in building coaling stations? Could you say a few words about the coaling stations that the Pacific Mail Service used?
I'm sorry, I didn't really understand your question. Could you speak more slowly, please?
To run a steamship service across the Pacific in the late 19th century, you needed ships and you also needed coal.
Yeah.
And most ships had a fairly short range, so they had to coal several times before they could get across the Pacific. And so I know many countries set up coaling stations for their navies in this period of time. Did the commercial services set up their own stations? When aviation started in the 1930s, of course, Juan Trippe had to set up his own little airports and hotels all across the Pacific for his planes to get across. So was he following the practice of the steamship companies, or did the steamship companies did Pacific Mail, Steamship Mail, have its own coaling stations? Did they use other people's coaling stations? Or, well, it turns out that setting up coaling stations is a lot of work, so I'm just curious what they had to do to put that part of that work together.
Well, thank you for your question. Well, I don't have the right answer, exact answer to your question, but to my knowledge, the reason why the PMSC made a stop in Japan was that it wanted to call Japanese ports to get to reach China. So their main interest was in China. So, but Japan was still needed to have coal there. But I don't know whose intention was it. So maybe the U.S. government intention or PMS's intention. I'm not sure yet.
And of course, they need coal in you said they stopped at Sandwich Islands.
Yeah.
So they use Sandwich Islands for coaling.
Sorry, I don't know.
We'll talk to you. I'll talk to you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, any?
My name is Kikuchi, and I'm with Washington Research and Analysis. And Professor Oi's theme is very interesting to me. I had followed the life and development of Mitsubishi Iwasaki family, and of course they started off as a shipping company, and their main competition when they started in late, let's say 1880s, was to compete against, first of all, the P&O lines, and also the U.S. lines that had coastal shipping in Japan. And then the next step was to compete in routes to Shanghai from Japan, and then finally compete in the Pacific. Now, the coal situation, the first main thing about Japan's industry was to supply coal, as you mentioned, to Western ships, and also water. Yokohama was famous for the quality of water, and same for Kobe, Miyamizu and all that. The best water for sake also was good for drinking, and that's why Japan was a necessary stopping point, and also that's why Commodore Perry came to open up the ports of Japan. That's my understanding. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments.
Okay, and yes, thank you.
Excuse me. My name is Yuki Mamura. I'm sorry. This snowfall caused me a little aged behavior of my throat. Anyway, I'm with the Washington Strategy Group, and also I'm founding chair of the Washington Innovation Network, WIN, WIN for short, to bring the Japanese and American, wherever they are, interested in the technology, science, innovation, so on and so forth. We have meetings every other month. Anyway, I congratulate the panel because this town doesn't have many of the platforms to discuss national securities, business, economic relations, education, culture, so on and so forth, but very few to discuss science, technology, or technology, innovation, entrepreneurship, and so on and so forth. So I have two questions to Dr. Oi in terms of technology innovation or technology transfer. I just like to know whether the trans-Pacific shipping, any technological innovation, for instance, in navigation technology, did it bring any innovations or the advancement for the technology because of the expanded shipping between the United States, Japan, China? Second question is, how did the immigrants bring any contribution to the technological innovation from Japan, China, to the United States, Or by bringing immigrants from these countries, did the United States facilitate these countries any technological innovation?
Thank you for your questions. Well, as for the first question, whether Trans-Pacific steamship brought any advancement of technology, well, I haven't looked that aspect. So far, I've been looking at PMSC in light of immigration. So I don't really look at pure scientific aspects. So I'm sorry, I can't answer the question. And the second point, whether immigrants influenced advancement of technology or not. And as for the Trans-Pacific route, there hasn't been so many research on the Trans-Pacific route, like I said in my presentation. And as for the transatlantic route of migration from European countries to America, there are more research on it. But many researchers interested in that question, whether immigration increased the level of advanced immigration contributed to the advancement of technology, or the advancement of technology increased the level of immigration. And there are lots of controversies, but there hasn't been any decisive answer to the question. And in my research, I tried to, I believe that Trans-Pacific, not immigration contributed to technology advancement, but vice versa. I believe that technological advancement increased the immigration, but I don't have any proof yet, so I need more time to think about that. Thank you.
The title of your research covers late 18th to early 19th century. 19th century to 20th century. At that time, there was not much technology contribution between two regions. But 60s, from 60s, 70s, 80s, if you look at technological innovation or transfer or exchange between Asia and the United States, you may find a lot of interesting things because of Indians, because of Chinese, because of sometimes to some extent Japanese, and vice versa. So I would like to encourage you to take a look at that part of the history so that you may find more interesting things.
Thank you for encouragement.
Can I just answer part of the first question? If we stay with the steamships, of course we know that 1860, the first time Japanese sailed across the Pacific on Kanin Maru was with American captains, and they learned how to sail such vast span of water. So in that sense, yes, there was a story of transfer of navigation technology.
Sorry. Okay, please.
Thank you. Professor Karianis with George Washington, Faculty of Science, Technology, Innovation, and Entrepreneurship. And I'd like to ask Professor Miva and Professor Yang, a colleague, a question about the comment on the what I would call the apparent, deconstructing the apparent folly, stupidity, as you, yeah, which obviously I don't believe is the case. And I think what I would like to invite comments on is on three potential approaches to this, including an implicit game theoretic dimension. And we could have technological arrogance, as was implied. It could be an issue of racism. Japan and Germany were allies of circumstance, necessity, and convenience. If I'm not mistaken, in the First War, Japan was actually fighting on the other side, right? And the Germans did not necessarily see the Japanese as equals. So maybe it wasn't just the Japanese looking for information, maybe it wasn't forthcoming to begin with. But in addition, the question is, what could that tell us? This very interesting phenomenon you observe, which is a persistent series of misinterpretations and miscalculations with huge implications strategically. What could that tell us about today and tomorrow? Because these apparent follies may indeed be unfolding also as we observe things, including in that same region. So I would like some thoughts in that regard, and thank you again. And by the way, just a quick observation on the previous question that I also found very interesting. Technology transfer really happens one person at a time. So human traffic flows, whether it's tourism or other things, economically driven, are very important ingredients of technology transfer. So that's, I wanted to reinforce that. Thank you.
I would like to say one example. China want to get the rare metal technology, want to introduce rare metal technology from Japanese company. Japanese company hesitate to give China rare metal technology. So in some cases, Chinese scientists want to develop by himself. But China use politicians to introduce technology from Japan. But Japanese company, the companies don't give China's company or Chinese good information, because Japanese company use a lot of money to develop the technologies. So sometimes I think I told my Chinese friends, China use politicians. That is one example. And another example, in the United States, TV commercial, the United States is the #1 country for producing the natural gases. But it is very difficult to tell in the future natural gas is used, became more and more popular in the United States. But it is very difficult. It is very difficult to tell the future. Technology is very difficult to predict the future. So we pay attention to every way of technology, every aspect of technology, every materials, natural gases, atomic energies, oil and oil shale, everything. I think. Is it okay? My question, yeah.
Does Professor Yang have any comments?
Peter is the president.
Not at the moment. I think that's need a further investigation. But I think the initial answer provided by Professor Miwa may shed some light. Namely, the Imperial Army had a very, very close relationship with Germany, whereas the Imperial Navy was more distant. So that could affect their orientation.
Okay, let's summarize.
I just wanted to supplement the point of this, whether trans-Pacific shipping lines in enhanced technology. As you recall, when Mitsubishi shipping company started, before Nihon Yusen was established as a competitive device to sort of control the rapid growth of Mitsubishi shipping. When the company started, or the early days, there were about 1,000 employees, but 300 or so, 30% of the employees were Americans or British, because those were the people who knew how to operate steamships. And therefore, there's this obvious transfer of technology from the West to Japan at that time, because the Japanese, not to mention the Sakamoto Ryoma's kind of effort to learn how to run ships, they didn't know. So all the knowledge of operating modern steamships came from abroad in the first phase.
Probably from UK was
Yes.
more the case, because most of the earlier ships were built in British dockyards and then they were piloted by Japanese captains back to Japan.
Yeah, and then they learned how to build those ships also, starting from Nagasaki.
Okay, next please.
Thank you for great presentations. My name is Saki Kishimoto from the University of Tokyo. Currently, I'm doing research about military policy of United States toward China. And during, as Professor Miura mentioned, during World War II, Japan didn't have a good technology and technological knowledge, and there was a huge gap between Japan and other countries, including United States, in terms of technology and technological knowledge. But now we have a very strong U.S.-Japan security alliance. So I was wondering how U.S.-Japan technological cooperation has been improved after World War II. Could you elaborate more about the present situation after World War II?
Yeah. Your question is what I want to study. Yeah. Just before the Pearl Harbor attack, some Americans were against the oil embargoes. Admiral Stark, Admiral Pratt, and Postmaster Walker. They are against the war, and Colonel Howe too, in my view. And FDR made, I think so, he want to avoid the war. But some hardliner, Stevenson, Ickes, Morgenthau, they want to put the embargo on Japan. They stopped the oil. Young officers, Japanese young officers get angry. We can't use military forces without engine, aviation gasoline. So they attack the Pearl Harbor. And they want to catch the Dutch East Indies, military occupied. And Admiral Stark knows the fact. After the end of the war, Stark and Pratt made every effort to keep a good relation with Japan. So I think Stark, Admiral Pratt, Herbert Hoover, and they made efforts to keep good relations. So this is very interesting. Some are against war, and some are for war. So Admiral Nomura in Washington, D.C., he negotiated with the United States in order to avoid the war. Everybody knows Nomura made every effort to avoid the war. So that is very interesting. I'm interested in that point. Please read my book. Okay? You read this my book. You can read my book in Library of Congress. Okay? Chapter 1, 2, 3, 4. That's all. I'm very poor at English, so.
When is the exam?
Yeah.
When is the exam?
Exam?
After reading, yes.
After reading, yeah. No, he's very clever, I know. Thank you. Is that okay?
Thank you. Any other questions? I think one final question or comment is about. Yeah.
Is it possible, if I may, I'm sorry. Oh, yes.
Yeah.
So this is completely maybe out of context, but maybe related.
the automobiles in Japan, they have the driving wheel on the right or the wrong side, which is exactly the same as in the UK. I wonder if there is an implicit link in terms of where the technology was transferred and when, I don't know. The second comment about this whole discussion, and this is a lot of speculation, but what you were describing just now about who was against and for all that, what was happening between the US and Japan did not happen in a vacuum. We know at the time there was a fierce battle in the US between isolationists and people who wanted to bring the US into the war related to Germany and what was going on in Europe. So it may be, just a speculation, and that is not certainly to absolve people from responsibilities, but it may be that Japan was pushed into the war to create a situation that would then, force, in quotes, the hand of President Roosevelt. But that's a different story.
Do you have any other comments? Okay. We need to conclude this panel. I think two papers have a good contrast. The Professor Oi's paper focuses on transportation and movement from much more sociological perspectives, and the Professor Miller's paper more on the military and technological perspectives. I've enjoyed organizing this panel. Thank you for your cooperation and kind attention. Thank you.
Thank you.